Hi, I'm Charlene Jurgensen. Welcome to Quilting from the Heartland. Today we're going to make the grandmother's flower garden, which has been a favorite of quilters for a long time. Interest in this design was revived during the 1930s because the quilters could use all of their scraps, and they didn't have to worry about matching the flowers or patterns in the designs. It has been made in every part of North America, in every size, and in every type of fabric, although the most preferred fabric is 100% cotton. The samples that I'm going to show you today, the first one was made in the 1930s, and it starts out in the center with a bright yellow flower, and then it is surrounded by colors from the 30s, which happen to be the solid fabric. And then the next row form the diamonds, and they're pastel floral patterns from the 1930s. This particular quilt was made by Blum, and I'm very pleased that the family would allow me to share this quilt with you. I fell in love with this quilt and asked them if I could share it. The second quilt that I would like to show you was made by Martha Blum, who happened to be a daughter-in-law of Helen Blum, and this one was made in the 70s. She also started out the center of the grandmother's flower garden with a yellow center, and then surrounded it with solids, and then a floral print, and the path that goes between the grandmother's flower garden is a pastel blue. Something that I've noticed when studying the grandmother's flower gardens, that the paths will vary. Sometimes they will be a green path or a muslin path. Most of the ones from the Depression were of a green path that went through the flower garden. The flower garden that we're going to make today is a little bit different than the ones that I just shared with you. And the difference is that we are going to put a path of diamonds, and then in the corners we're going to put a little triangle. The beginning rows, or every other row in this pattern, will start out also with diamonds that will finish off this circle to form the grandmother's flower garden. All of the ones in the flower garden that we're making today are going to be surrounded first with a muslin, and then the path will be of the diamonds and the triangles. Before we get started, I want to remind you that you need to pre-wash all of your fabric, whether it be scraps or not. It's still just as important. Dry them in the automatic dryer, and then take the time to press them. And like I said, you can use scraps. It doesn't take very much fabric to make one of the flowers in the grandmother's flower garden. And I'm using fabrics that are reproductions from the 30s because I happen to like them very much. I have folded the fabrics in half, and I have matched the selvages down here, and I'm going to save time by cutting 3 types of flowers at one time. Lay a long ruler on top of all of those strips of fabric and match up the edge of the ruler out here, and straighten all of them at one time. I do all of the cutting with the rotary cutter because I feel that it gives me the most accuracy that I can get. After I have made that first cut, then turn the board without disturbing the fabric at all. You lose so much accuracy if you pick up the strips and turn them, and so this is the best way to do it. We're going to use for the pattern shapes today templates that are pink in color so that you don't lose them in the fabric, and also ones that you can cut along the edge with a rotary cutter. They have the scant 1/4 inch included in them, and I've prepared them ahead of time by putting fabric grips on the back of them so that they don't slide on the fabric when I'm cutting. We are going to use a hexagon, a diamond, and a triangle to make our design today. Lay your template up on top of the ruler and slide the ruler over to match the line with the edge of the straightened fabric. And then remove the template and make the cut through all of the fabrics at one time. Then I like to work on a smaller size board after I have the original strips cut because it's easier to turn my work as I cut around the templates. Now bifold the fabric and place it up on top of the board. That will make it much easier for you to work. Place the template, which happens to be a hexagon, up on top of the cut strips and match the edge of the template with the edge of the fabric. The first cut that you make, go backwards and then go up to the corner and complete the cut going all the way around. Turn the mat board instead of the template and the fabric and do the rest of the cutting. That's how easy it is, and you would just simply go all the way across that strip until you have used it all up. Now I'm not going to take your time to watch me cut up all these pieces, but just go all the way across until you've used it all up. The next piece that we're going to cut is the diamonds that go into the pattern. And for that, I'm going to show you a little bit different way how to straighten the fabric. If you don't happen to have the long ruler that I just used, you can use a smaller ruler, which happens to be a 6 by 12-inch ruler. And to straighten fabric using that length ruler, fold your fabric in half, matching up the selvage edges, and then in half again. So you now have the fabric folded into fourths. Place the shorter ruler up on top of this piece of fabric and remove the rough edge over here. And just like we did before, turn the mat board and not your ruler and the fabric. Now take the diamond and lay it up on top of the ruler and slide the ruler over to match up with the cut edge of the fabric. See the fabric below there? Match up the line on the ruler with the edge of the fabric. And then cut these strips off. And again, I might move to a smaller mat board to make it easier to work on. Place the strips up there, and I'm going to leave them folded like this so that I can get more pieces at one time. Place the template down on top of the cut strips and make the first cut going backwards, and then go in about 1/4 of an inch and continue on cutting. Turn your mat board and do the same on the other side. And that's how we would cut the pieces that form the path through the center of the quilt. You would repeat that same process with the triangle, just simply cutting the strips to fit that particular piece and put them into the quilt. The last one that I'm going to cut is the centers and the muslin. We're going to cut those at the same time today. Again, we will place those up on top of the board. Put your mat board so that it'll accommodate the width of the fabric when it's folded in half, and place them on top of each other, just like this, so that you don't waste time straightening each one separately. Then place the ruler up on top of there, and again straighten that edge of fabric. I find that I have so much more accuracy when I do it like this than if I take each one separately and then try to match the pieces on top of each other. I used to do each one separately, but I found that this is much faster and in the end more accurate. Again, move the ruler to match the edge of the fabric and cut your strip the width that you need to fit the hexagon. And then again, take and bifold your fabric, and this time we'll just work up on top of the bigger board and cut the pieces for the center and then also for the path that goes through the grandmother's flower garden. Now if I weren't using a large or a smaller board, this is what you have to do. You have to cut backhanded sometimes if you don't want to turn the board. So that's why I like to show you how much easier it is to use a smaller board. Well, that's all the cutting that we have to do for the grandmother's flower garden, and we're already ready to start arranging the flowers, and then we will go to the sewing board, or sewing table, excuse me. The first thing that I do is I arrange the flowers on a flannel board, which I have prepared using a flannel covering over a foam core board. And the pieces adhere to that, and I don't have to use pins to keep them in place, and they're all ready now in the arrangement when I go to the sewing machine, and I don't have to figure out what piece goes where. I would like to explain a little bit about the past methods that I've used in putting the grandmother's flower garden together before I go to the sewing machine, and tell you about some of my failures and some of the things that have happened since then. The first time that I ever tried putting a grandmother's flower garden together, I hand-pieced it. And I thought that that was the only way to be able to put one of these together, because after all, that's what my neighbor Martha did, and she was trying to show me how. Well, after I had about 9 blocks together, I found out that there was no way in my lifetime that I was ever going to have one of these. So I gave up. And then a few years passed, and I decided I still want this design, so I'm going to combine some hand sewing and machine sewing, and then it will be something that I'll be able to have. Well, what I did then the second time was I did machine sew the seams that went across, and I made it into rows, and then I pivoted when I put the rows together. Well, this wasn't too bad, and I got a few more blocks done, but again realized that I was never going to have a completed project. Well, then the third time I decided, well, I have still a better method, and I decided that everything I did was going to be done on the sewing machine, and I treated each seam within the grandmother's flower garden as a separate one. And every time I started a new seam, I backed up at the beginning and end of each seam, and then I ironed the seams in one direction. And some of you will say, well, that's the directions that she wrote in the pattern that's published, and yes, that is what I did. It was the best that I knew how to do at the time, but since then I have come up with a much better technique, and I'm really pleased that I'm able to share it with you, because I now know that there is a much easier way to do it. And I'm going to show you the back side of a flower before we go to the sewing machine and show you what the difference is. On the back side, you'll see that all of the seams are now ironed open, and we don't have all the bulk in the corners that we were dealing with in the previous method that I had made. So let's take to the sewing machine one of our flowers that are laid out on the flannel board, and we'll start putting one together. When you put a grandmother's flower quilt or any other quilt together, I have found that I prefer using 100% cotton thread, because it is the same type of fiber that's in the fabric that you're using. Also, it's a good idea to use a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, because if you don't, you won't be able to make up for the amount of fabric used in the seam line. There are a couple of ways that you can achieve the scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. The first one, this particular sewing machine has a special foot for it that has the scant 1/4 inch seam allowance in it. The other one that I'm going to show you, I like to use sometimes when I piece, using a foot on my machine that has wide open space in the center, so that I can see what's happening right up by the needle position. And I can program the scant 1/4 inch on my machine by just pushing the dials on the front of the machine. When you start sewing the grandmother's flower garden together, you always start in the center of the design, and you'll work around the yellow hexagon in the very beginning. Place the two together, right sides together, And something that I'm going to do a little bit different when I make this design is I'm going to use some pins to hold the pieces in place. And I'm very familiar with where that scant 1/4 inch seam allowance is, so I don't have to put any marks on the fabric ahead of time. Now, a good idea for you to use if you're not sure of yourself would be to place a small ruler or have a small ruler like this by your sewing machine and just put a little dot where you want your seam to end. After you have pinned them right sides together, then put them under the presser foot, and the first thing that you do is back stitch up to the pin. And then when you get to the pin, you're going to go forward to the other end, and then you'll again back stitch when you get to that point. And if you jump over the pin or where you think you're going to go too far, then just lift the presser foot and put the pin at the point where you think it should be, and then back up. Okay, after you have sewn that seam now, we're going to take the time to press each seam open. And first I always finger press to set that seam open. And then take the iron and press just lightly on the top of it. And keep your iron handy so that you do take the time to press all of your seams as you go. Now I have another circle that's a little farther along in progress, and so I don't take the time for you to go all the way around the center. I'm going to jump over to this block and show you how to continue the design a little farther on. Now each time you add a hexagon, you always put the one that you're adding on the bottom. But first line it up on the top side, right sides together, and then turn it over. And this is the part that I have started to do that's new, this next step that has made putting this flower garden together so easy. The first part of the seam, yes, we're going to back up, but we're going to make this in one continuous seam instead of taking all the time to back up all the time. Again, place your block underneath the presser foot and just slightly hold on to those threads and back up to that pin. One more stitch. And then go forward up to the corner. And before I go any farther, I'm going to turn this piece over so that you can see what's happening underneath here. I'll point it out with the stiletto so that you can see exactly where I'm going to stop sewing. This is the corner where I'm going to pivot my needle without removing the block from the sewing machine. So sew up to that corner, and also I use the stiletto to hold the seam down so that it doesn't flip backwards when I'm sewing. Lift your presser foot up, and with your right hand go underneath and take the piece that you're adding and swing that around to the front, and the top part goes around to the back. And then match up the edges like this again, and put one pin where you want to stop, and then to make the corner that you're pivoting on a little bit more accurate, and you don't want to have a little hole in the corner because we don't want to have to tie this quilt, put the pin underneath the seam line that comes forward and insert the pin at a little bit of an angle, and make sure that your fabric is out behind the needle, and then continue forward. But before I continue forward, I'm going to show you what I do with my two fingers. The pointer finger is on the right side of the presser foot, and my middle finger is on the other side, and I guide my fabric, pushing the fabric against the seam line so I don't have a little hole there, and then continue on to the next pin. Now this becomes one automatic motion, and you don't even have to think about it after you've done it a few times. Then again, we'll clip those threads, and take the time to finger press those seams open, first with your finger and then with the iron. Now I have to admit that when I'm doing this back in my studio and nobody's watching me, I do go all the way around without pressing and then press all at one time. But today we'll take the time to press this so I can add the next piece. See how nice and flat that lays? It's much easier to hand quilt it later on too when you do it this way. You don't have all that bulk in the corners. Now the next seam that we're going to do, we will do two corners. We'll go here, here, and then end up over here. And like I told you before, the pattern that I have published and that's on the market now has you stopping at every seam. And so for those of you that have tried that one, you'll agree that this one is much easier to do. Again, look underneath to make sure that your corner is going to come out right. Put your pieces under the presser foot, right sides together, and back up to the pin. And then sew forward, and again using a stiletto or some sharp object to hold your fabric down. And pivot on the corner where the three fabrics come together. Stop with your needle in the down position, and this is a little bit of review, but we're going to go around two corners this time instead of one. Put your right hand underneath the piece, swing this around on the top, and continue on to the next corner. Now sometimes when you're putting these pieces together, it'll seem like you have too much fabric on the top side. Well, that's because you're stretching it. Sometimes some of the pieces are on the bias. Okay, so now match up these two pieces. Again, put the pin in the corner over here and guide it, and in one motion just continue on to the next corner. And stop with your needle in a down position, and we'll just repeat this process one more time so that you get it. Again, swing the top to the back of the machine, and the bottom piece that you're adding comes towards the front of the machine. Match up that corner and insert the pin 1/4 of an inch from the end where you want to stop. One more time, put the pin in at an angle and guide it with your fingers. And see how much faster it goes after you've done a couple. Just come to the next pin and stop. And then if you've gone too far, lift up the presser foot, insert the pin where you want it to go, and then back up. Now I'm not going to take your time to show you how to iron this piece open, but just like the other two pieces, you'll iron this seam, and this one, and you just have one more piece left to put in. After you have gone around with the second circle, you will continue on around with the white like this until you have surrounded all of the flowers that you're going to put into your grandmother's flower garden with a path of white. Now the next step is to add some green diamonds to make a path. And I'd like to show you how to put some of those in. When you add the diamonds to the grandmother's flower garden, you add them just like you did the small hexagons, with the piece that you add being on the bottom. The diamonds will fit in all the way around the grandmother's flower garden, except on each of the corners. Every 3 diamonds, after 3 diamonds, there will be a triangle put on. Turn the grandmother's flower garden over and match up the piece that you're going to add right sides together, and let's take a peek on the back side and see what's happening. See, there's the 1/4 inch seam allowance that's left over. Let's put a pin right there so that that doesn't shift on us when we sew the rest of the seam. And I'm not going to put a pin on this end because I know exactly where I want to stop. put it under the sewing machine, and we're going to back stitch up to the seam between the green and the muslin. And then when I put the needle down it goes too far onto the green, lift the presser foot, move it forward, and insert the pin back on the white. Come forward until you get to the corner and look underneath and make sure that everything is the way it's supposed to be. And I use the stiletto again to hold things in place. Actually, it becomes one of your fingers when you make this design. And stop right on that corner and pivot with the needle in a down position. And just like when you added the hexagons, you go underneath and pick up the diamond and you pivot that to the front, and the rest of the block goes to the back. And line up the piece over here on the front and put a pin where you want to stop with the scant 1/4 inch in front, and go out here and put another pin in here and continue on to the corner of the diamond. To finish the grandmother's flower garden, we will connect the rows together, pivoting on each one of these corners, stopping with the needle in the down position at every corner. I hope you've enjoyed watching one of my favorite quilt designs go together from Quilting from the Heartland.